Welcome back. I was going through this script earlier this week and kept returning to the same moment. Not the betrayal, not the courtroom, but the instant the protagonist chooses to say nothing while they carry the guitar out the door. That deliberate silence is the entire weapon, right here on Eternal Diary. The smell hit her first. Rosin and aged spruce and something underneath, a low organic sweetness, like wood that had absorbed decades of human breath. And Mara Chen opened her eyes to a ceiling she recognized. Water stain in the upper left corner shaped like a crescent. The overhead bulb had a small crack in its frosted casing that made the light wobble slightly in winter drafts. She had stared at this ceiling for 23 years. She had not expected to stare at it again. She lay still for a long time. The sheets were the same ones, washed too many times, soft to the point of disintegration, a pale blue that had once been navy. She pressed her palm flat against the mattress and felt the familiar dip near the center, the one that had curved to her specific weight over years of use, and something inside her chest did a thing she had no clinical name for. Not relief, not grief, not the surge of a person rescued from drowning. It was quieter than all of those. It was the sensation of a door she thought had sealed forever swinging open without a sound. She sat up slowly. The room. Her room, the same in every particular. The acoustic guitar stand in the corner held the Wren, her grandfather's 1959 Gibson ES 335, the one with the tobacco burst finish that had deepened over 60 years into something closer to dark amber, the one with the hairline crack along the upper bout that a luthier in Osaka had repaired so meticulously that you had to know exactly where to look. And the sight of it sitting there, unharmed, strings still wound tight, caused a physical sensation she had to press her lips together to contain. The Wren was here. That meant she had time. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum and breathed through her nose. 4 counts? 4 counts? 4 counts. The way she had learned in the years after everything dissolved, sitting in a studio apartment in a city that had never wanted her, practicing regulation because it was the only instrument she had left. She breathed until the sensation in her chest settled into something she could work with. Then she reached for her phone on the nightstand. The date on the screen confirmed what the condition of the room and the weight of her hair and the specific quality of January light through the curtains had already told her. January 9th, 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days before the morning she had sat in a hospital corridor in a city 400 miles from here with a fractured right hand and a phone that had been disconnected for non-payment and understood. So with the clarity of a person who has nothing left to protect herself from the truth, that she had been comprehensively and deliberately destroyed. 3 years, 4 months, 11 days. She set the phone down. She looked at the Wren. She looked at the ceiling. Then she got up and started making a list. She had died technically twice. The first time was the ordinary kind, a car accident on a November night, black ice, a highway overpass, and a drop that should have been unsurvivable but wasn't quite, which meant the second death was the slow administrative kind, the cancellation of everything she had built over a decade of work, executed by the people who had been standing closest to her the entire time. Of the two, she had found the second considerably more instructive. Mara Chen had been, in her previous life, a guitarist of the kind that critics struggled to categorize and record labels struggled to monetize, and audiences, the audiences that found her, struggled to leave. She played a style that sat at the intersection of jazz architecture and something rawer, more open-throated music that felt like a conversation between the guitar and the space around it. And she had spent her 20s building this into something fragile and genuine and hers. She headlined mid-sized venues. She had 3 albums. She had a publishing deal that, as she would understand only too late, had been structured in a way that ensured the royalties from her catalog flowed not to her, but to an LLC that her manager Declan Voss had created and that she had signed over control of during a period when she trusted him the way people trust the foundation of the house they live in. Not consciously, not with any particular active faith, but with the assumption that the ground beneath you holds. So Declan Voss was 41 years old, broadly handsome in the way of a man who had always been told he was handsome and had organized his personality around this. And he had been managing Mara's career for 6 years when he began sleeping with her. This had felt at the time like an organic development. Later, Later, when she had nothing but time and the granular work of retrospection, she understood that it had been strategic, that the intimacy had been a mechanism, that the 6 years of apparent advocacy and genuine effort and dinners, where he remembered what she ordered and texts he sent at the exact frequency required to create the impression of someone who was thinking of her, that all of this had been the construction of a trust that he needed in order to do what he had always intended to do. She did not know this while it was happening. She knew it now. She wrote his name at the top of a page in the spiral notebook she kept on her nightstand. She had always kept a notebook there, always, across 2 lives, and she wrote it without particular emotion. Declan Voss. Below it, she wrote 2 other names, Vivian Chen, Lyra Chen. Her stepmother and her half-sister, respectively. The guitar was the point of convergence. This was what she had worked out in the long months of her first life's aftermath. Sitting in the studio apartment with the fractured hand that had not healed cleanly because she hadn't had insurance and had not gone back for the follow-up appointment because the bill from the first visit had already been forwarded to a collections agency. The guitar was where all 3 of them had met, where their separate agendas had briefly aligned, and where they had collectively made the error that had cost her everything, but that would this time cost them considerably more. The wren had belonged to her grandfather, Han Chen, who had played it from 1961 until his hands gave out in 1994, and who had left it to Mara in a will that Vivian had contested and lost, which meant that Vivian had been sitting with that loss for 17 years by the time the opportunity arose. The guitar was valued, officially by the insurance assessor, when Mara was 26 and had finally thought to have it documented, at $280,000. The value of a 1959 Gibson ES 335 in that condition, with that provenance, and with the additional documentation of Han Chen's performance history, which Mara had spent 3 years compiling because she loved him, and because she understood that the guitar was not only an object, but a record of a life. The value had continued to climb in the years since the assessment, and by the time they sold it, it had been worth considerably more. They had sold it for $95,000. Through a private dealer Declan had sourced and vouched for, paid in a transaction structured to look like a distressed sale, the proceeds divided between an account Vivian controlled and a percentage that was documented as management fees in paperwork Mara had signed, had been guided to sign during a period of genuine crisis. The weeks after the accident, when her hand was in a splint and she was on medication that blurred the edges of everything, believing she was authorizing the sale of studio equipment she no longer needed. She had not read the paperwork carefully enough. She had trusted Declan to tell her what she was signing. This was the error she did not intend to repeat. The list she made that first morning back was not a list of grievances. She was 31 years old, and she had already grieved. In the first life, until the shape of grief became familiar enough to function inside, and she had no interest in doing it again. The list was operational. It had 4 columns: entity, asset, vulnerability, timeline. She wrote in small, precise letters, the way she had always written music notation, the way her grandfather had taught her, not to be neat but to be exact, because inexactness costs you. The first thing she needed to do was establish the intellectual property framework before anyone else could. In her first life, the publishing deal had been signed 14 months from now, and the LLC that ate her catalog had been incorporated 6 months before that, meaning Declan had been building the structure for over a year while she believed he was negotiating on her behalf. The deal had given her a 15% royalty on her existing catalog and a 60% stake in new compositions, which sounded to someone who was not a music attorney like a reasonable arrangement, and which was in reality a mechanism for systematically stripping her of the economic value of her work. She needed a music attorney. Specifically, she needed Corinne Ajay, who was at this point in time a junior associate at a firm in Midtown Manhattan, and who would, 7 years from now, become one of the foremost intellectual property litigators in the country, and who had, in Mara's first life, been the person who reviewed the publishing contract 2 years too late and said in a voice stripped of professional affect, "Who let you sign this?" Mara had not known her then. She knew her now. She had spent the first life's aftermath reading every case Corinne Ajay had ever touched because it was a way of understanding the precise mechanism of her own destruction, and because it was something to do with the long nights that did not involve the particular kind of thinking that was not useful. She would find Corinne Ajay first. The second thing was the corporate structure. Before Declan's LLC could be incorporated with her name attached to it, she needed to create her own holding company for the catalog. A clean structure, properly capitalized, with her as the sole beneficial owner. He organized in a jurisdiction whose laws would make it expensive and procedurally complex for anyone to challenge her ownership. She needed to transfer the rights to her existing 3 albums into this structure. She needed to do this before Declan proposed the publishing deal, which he would do, she now knew, at a dinner at the Italian restaurant he liked on the Upper West Side. Over a pasta she would barely taste because he would be telling her about an opportunity he had been working on for months on her behalf. And she would be so focused on the texture of his apparent enthusiasm that she would not register the language he was using. She knew the language now. She wrote it in the notebook. Controlled composition clauses, reversion rights limited to non-commercial exploitation only, administration rights assigned in perpetuity, pipeline provisions. She wrote everything she had learned in the long aftermath, from reading contracts and case files and music industry litigation reports, because the one thing the hospital corridor and the studio apartment and the fractured hand and the disconnected phone had given her was time, and she had not wasted it. The third thing was the guitar, and this was the part that required a particular quality of stillness that she had spent some months, even after the rebirth, working up to. She was going to let them take it. Not because she couldn't stop them. She could stop them. She could go to Vivian's house today, her father's old house, the one she'd been legally entitled to a share of, and had been maneuvered out of in a settlement that she had accepted because she was 28 and tired, and Declan had told her the legal fees would cost more than the share was worth. She could go there today and have the conversation that would make clear she knew what was coming and that it would not be permitted. She could lock the guitar in a bank vault. She could take it on the road with her. She could do any number of things that would prevent what happened from happening. But if she prevented it, she lost the evidence. This was the thing she had turned over and over in the studio apartment, in the months when the understanding of what had been done to her was still new enough to have a physical quality, a weight that sat on her sternum when she woke up in the morning. The guitar sale was the one element of the entire operation that was unambiguously, documentably criminal. The publishing deal had been sharp practice and manipulation, and the exploitation of a power imbalance and a trust she had extended in good faith, but it had been signed. Her signature was on it. A court would look at that signature, and whatever the equities of the situation, whatever the emotional reality, whatever she knew about the circumstances under which she had signed, the document existed. The LLC existed. The transfer of rights had been documented. The guitar was different. She had not signed anything authorizing its sale. The documentation that Declan had prepared, the paperwork she had been guided through during the post-accident fog, had been about the studio equipment. She had verified this in her first life. Finally, 18 months after the sale, when she had obtained copies of everything she had signed and laid it out on the floor of the studio apartment and gone through it with the methodical attention of someone who could not afford to be wrong again. The studio equipment sale had been real. The guitar sale had been documented nowhere. Declan had used her studio equipment sale as a paper trail that gestured at her authorization, while the actual transaction for the Wren had been conducted entirely through Vivian's channels, with Declan taking his percentage as cash, a payment that appeared in none of the documented records of their professional relationship. If she allowed the sale to happen again, she would have the evidence. She would have the transaction records. She would have the communications between Declan and Vivian. This time, she would have a forensic digital investigator in place 6 weeks before the sale because she now knew the approximate timeline, and she would have everything on record. She would have the gap between the guitar's assessed value and the sale price, which constituted evidence of undervaluation in a private sale that a forensic accountant could present as consistent with a structured attempt to minimize traceable proceeds. She would have the testimony of the private dealer, who in her first life had felt, she suspected, some ambient guilt about the transaction, and who had been, when Mara's attorney had eventually located him, 3 years too late to be actionable, willing to confirm what he knew. This time, his confirmation would come at the right moment. The guitar would be the anchor point for a civil suit encompassing fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, conversion of personal property, and, depending on what the forensic review of the LLC documents revealed, potentially conspiracy to defraud. She was going to let them take the Wren, and then she was going to take everything. The rosin smell was still in the room. She crossed to the guitar stand and lifted the wren carefully. Both hands under the body, the way her grandfather had shown her, never by the neck alone, treat it like a living thing you're responsible for, and sat on the edge of the bed with it across her lap. The weight of it was the same. The finish under her fingers was the same cool, lacquer overwood sensation she had known since she was 11 years old and Han-Chen had first placed it in her hands and said, in Cantonese, that a good guitar teaches you patience before it teaches you anything else. She played nothing. She held it. There was a song she had written at 24, in the first year of her relationship with Declan, during a period when she had believed she was happy and had written music that reflected this. Open chord voicings, a certain kind of upward melodic resolution, the sound of something arriving rather than departing. The song was called Meridian, and it was the most commercially successful thing she had ever recorded. And it was Declan's favorite, not because he had any particular sensitivity to music, but because it was the song that had generated the most licensing revenue, the song that had placed in 3 television shows and 2 film trailers, and a commercial for a watch brand, the song that had put the most money into the LLC that bore his name. It was also the song that audiences asked for most. The song people shouted from the crowd between other songs. The song that made people feel, apparently, something specific and wanted. The sound of something arriving. She had not played it in her first life after the sale. Had not been able to, had not had the guitar, had not had venues, had not had anything. She would not play it in this life either. Not because she couldn't. She could play it right now. She remembered every note, but she understood. Had understood. In the long aftermath, that Meridian belonged to the version of herself that had not known what she was walking toward. Playing it would be a collaboration with that version of herself. It would be a kindness to the people who had destroyed her. It would generate royalties that would flow, if she was not careful, into structures that were not hers. It would mean performing a document of her own naivety for audiences who had no idea they were watching her do it. She was not going to do that. She placed the wren back on the stand. She went to make coffee. She thought about Corinne Adji. She thought about the specific language of the forensic accounting report she intended to commission. She thought about the timeline, the 3 years and 4 months and 11 days she had, and she divided them into phases the way she divided a composition into movements. Not rigidly, but with an internal logic, each section built on what came before. Each resolution earned by what had been established. Phase 1 was the foundation, legal structure, copyright registration, professional relationships. Phase 2 was the waiting. This was the part that required the particular quality of stillness. She had to be close enough to all 3 of them, Declan, Vivian, Lyra, to be credible as the person she had been before, the one who trusted them, the one who had not yet understood. She had to play the role of herself before with enough accuracy that none of them looked more carefully. This was harder than it sounded. She was not the person she had been. The studio apartment and the fractured hand and the methodical reading of every document she had ever signed had changed the architecture of her entirely. She would have to manage her eyes specifically, which was where the change was most visible. A quality of attention that she had not had before. A kind of steady. A unperturbed watchfulness that people found she had noticed in the months since the rebirth, slightly unnerving when they caught it. Phase 3 was the execution. Phase 4 was the silence. Phase 4 was the part she thought about most. She found Corinne Adji through a process that took 6 weeks and felt, at several points, like working a lock in the dark. She knew what she was looking for. She could feel the mechanism. She simply had to move carefully enough to find the engagement point without forcing anything. She had the name of the firm from memory. She had the recollection of a profile piece she had read in The First Life that had mentioned Adji graduated law school at 26 and had clerked for a federal judge before joining the firm, which meant that at this point in the timeline, Adji was either still clerking or had recently joined. The firm's website listed associates, but not their full credentials. Mara sent a carefully composed email requesting a consultation on music publishing matters and asking if they had anyone with particular experience in IP rights for independent artists, and the response came back from the managing partner's assistant with a list of 3 associates, one of whom was Corinne Adji. The consultation was in a conference room on the 38th floor of a building in Midtown that smelled of recycled air and the specific variety of coffee that office machines produce, which has a scorched quality, a bitterness that no amount of cream resolves. Ajay was younger than Mara had expected. She had seen photographs in the first life. New was from a period when Ajay was in her mid-30s and projected the settled authority of someone who had won enough to no longer feel the need to demonstrate that she was going to, and the younger version of her had a precision about her stillness, a quality of attention she kept slightly concealed behind a professional pleasantness that Mara recognized because it was the same quality she was working on in herself. She laid out what she needed. Not the full history, not the rebirth, not the studio apartment or the fractured hand. She laid out the professional reality. She had 3 albums and an existing informal management arrangement, and she wanted to ensure that her catalog was properly protected before any publishing discussions began. And she wanted a corporate structure through which to hold her IP that was clean and correctly capitalized and organized in a jurisdiction with protective laws. And she wanted this done before she had any further conversations with anyone about her professional future. Ajay listened without interrupting. She made notes in a small, precise handwriting that Mara could see from across the table. When Mara finished, Ajay said, "What specifically are you concerned about?" It was not phrased as a question. It was phrased as an observation that something existed to be concerned about, and that Ajay had already inferred the approximate shape of it. "My management relationship has structural ambiguities," Mara said. "I want to make sure those ambiguities are resolved in the correct direction before they become relevant." A pause. Then Ajay said, "All right," and her tone indicated that she understood this was not the full account and that she would work with what she had been given and that she was capable of protecting someone without knowing everything about what she was protecting them from. This was precisely what Mara needed. Over the following 3 months, Ajay constructed the holding company, Wren Sound Holdings, LLC, organized in Delaware with a straightforward operating agreement and Mara as the sole member, and transferred the rights to Mara's 3 albums into it. The transfer was documented cleanly. The copyright registrations were updated. The existing informal agreements with Declan were examined and found to be, as Ajay put it in a written memo that she drafted with the brisk clarity of someone who has identified a problem and has already begun solving it, legally ambiguous in several respects, none of which favor your position. A formal management agreement was drafted, one that Declan had not proposed and that Mara brought to him as a document she said she had put together with a paralegal friend because she needed him to sign it without understanding what it actually did. What it actually did was limit his administrative authority over her catalog to a defined list of specifically enumerated actions, excluded his ability to enter into any licensing or publishing deal without her written consent obtained independently of any document he presented for signature, and contained a fiduciary duty clause that made explicit what the law in most circumstances already implied, but that was considerably more powerful when it was written into the contract itself rather than existing only in the background principles of agency law. Declan had read it with the expression of a person who is accustomed to being the one who presents documents rather than the one who receives them, and she had watched him work through the implications and arrive. She could see him arrive at the conclusion that signing it was less risky than the conversation that refusing to sign it would require. He was not a lawyer. He read contracts the way most non-lawyers read contracts, for the broad strokes, for the obvious terms, for the salary and the percentages. He had missed the fiduciary clause and the enumeration of administrative authority and the specific language about independent consent. Or he had seen them and assessed them as standard and non-threatening. Either way, he signed it. Ajay, when Mara told her he had signed it, she did not tell Ajay how she had characterized the document's provenance, had simply said, "Good," and returned to the next item on the agenda. Vivian's house was 40 minutes from the city by train and had been, until Mara's father died 6 years ago, the house that Mara had understood as the secondary residence, the family house, the one where the garden had the fig tree her father had planted the year she was born, and where the kitchen smelled of the preserved lemons Vivian kept in a crock on the counter, and where Lyra had grown up moving through the rooms with the entitlement of someone who had never been required to consider that a space might not entirely belong to her. Mara visited because not visiting would have been a deviation from the pattern. She was the person she had been before, or a sufficient approximation. She arrived with pastries from the bakery on the corner of Vivian Street. She had always brought pastries. It was the specific texture of the relationship. Not warm enough for empty hands, but not warm enough for anything more considered. And she sat in the kitchen that smelled of preserved lemons and drank tea that Vivian made too strong and watched her stepmother move through the space with the particular quality of ease that a person has when they have decided something and not yet acted on it. The decision was visible if you knew what to look for. Vivian Chen was 63 years old and had the posture of someone who had once been quite attractive and still drew satisfaction from this. She wore her silver hair cut short and maintained a kind of considered grooming that was more about not being seen to have let anything go than about any particular pleasure in the result. She was not by nature an affectionate person. She had never been unkind to Mara. Oh, exactly. She had always occupied the space of someone who tolerated the presence of a reminder of her husband's life before her with a grace that she considered sufficient, but she had also never pretended that Mara's interests were her own. Lyra came in from the back garden 20 minutes into the visit. She was 26 and had their father's coloring, but Vivian's posture and a quality that Mara had once found simply abrasive and had since understood as something more precise. She was someone who had been trained by a lifetime of living adjacent to something she was told was hers, to see any asset she could reach as available to her. The guitar was in Mara's room, which was technically a guest room at this point, but which still held the guitar stand and the notebooks and the shelf of music books, because Mara had not wanted to displace her things from the room entirely, and because she had not, in the first life, understood why she should. She understood now. Lyra poured herself tea and sat at the kitchen table, and the conversation moved through its usual channels. Her job at a gallery in the city, Vivian's comments on the garden, the pastries going faster than Mara had expected, and Mara watched both of them with the particular quality of attention she was working to keep concealed and noted the look that passed between them when she mentioned she had been on the road for the past 3 weeks, a run of shows in the Northeast. The look was not dramatic. It was the brief, involuntary coordination of two people who share a plan and are monitoring the same variable. She had been away for 3 weeks. The guitar had been here, in the house, unattended. She held her tea with both hands and asked Lyra about the gallery and listened to the answer with what she hoped was the expression of someone who was present in this kitchen and thinking about nothing that had not yet happened. The forensic digital investigator she hired was a woman named Priya Nair, who operated a small firm that specialized in pre-litigation evidence preservation and who had been referred to her by Ajay, who maintained. So Mara had understood from their working relationship a network of specialists she used with a pragmatism that was entirely unmarked by the kind of professional ego that made some lawyers reluctant to acknowledge the limits of their own expertise. Ajay had said, "I have someone if this is going where I think it might be going," and had not asked for more information, and Mara had said, "Yes, it probably is," and the referral had been made. St. Nair was methodical and compact in her explanations. She said what she needed to say in the number of words it required and not more, which Mara appreciated because it was a quality she recognized as professional discipline, and she said, when Mara had described the general shape of what she needed, "You know when this is going to happen. So we have a window. If we set up properly inside that window, we'll have everything." "I know the approximate timeline," Mara said. "New within a 6-week range?" "That's enough," Nair said. "I'll need access to email accounts they've used to communicate with each other about anything related to you or your assets. I'll need authorization in writing from you for any of your accounts. For theirs, we'll need to do it differently." The differently was legal. It always was with Nair. She had said in their first conversation that she didn't do anything that would taint evidence. And she had said it the way people say things that are non-negotiable, without emphasis, because the emphasis would suggest it might be otherwise. The differently in this case meant monitoring the communications that were available through legitimate means, the management platform that Mara had been using to coordinate with Declan, which meant Declan's communications through that system were accessible, and the legal process they would initiate when the time came, so to obtain the rest through discovery. The evidence from the sale itself, Nair said, transaction records, communications with the dealer, any documentation of proceeds, that's what a civil suit would rest on. The digital record is the foundation. We need to establish it before the sale, not after. "Yes," Mara said, "you're going to let it happen." It was not phrased as a question. "Yes," Mara said again. Nair looked at her for a moment. A brief, precise assessment, and then made a note and moved on to the next item on her preparation list. She played every show that year without Meridian. Not conspicuously, not as an absence she drew attention to. She simply built her set lists around everything else. The catalog was 3 albums deep, plus unreleased material she had been developing, and she arranged each set with the same structural attention she gave to composition, so that what was not present was not felt as a gap. The audiences who knew her work well enough to notice the omission sometimes asked after shows, standing near the merch table, or outside the venue in the particular quality of post-concert air that smells of crowd warmth in October and the remnants of the opener's fog machine. She told them it was resting. She told them she was rearranging her approach to it. She said these things pleasantly and truthfully, in the sense that they were statements that did not contain a lie. The song was resting. Permanently. Declan noticed. Of course he noticed. It was Meridian that had generated the licensing revenue, and its absence from live performances affected the visibility of the track, and the visibility of the track affected the licensing pipeline. And this had a downstream effect on his income, which was the mechanism through which he noticed most things about her career. He mentioned it twice, both times framed as a professional observation, a suggestion that audiences responded well to it, and that consistency in live performance contributed to catalog value. She received both mentions with a thoughtfulness that she hoped communicated consideration without commitment. She did not play Meridian. She was writing new material. This was the part of the return that had surprised her, not the legal architecture, not the strategic patience, not even the particular quality of stillness required to sit in Vivian's kitchen and watch the look pass between her stepmother and her half-sister, but the music. She had expected to feel coming back a sort of professional calculation about the new compositions. What would be useful? What would be strategic? What would establish her position in a way that served the larger plan? Instead, she found that the music came from the same place it had always come from, untouched by what she knew, and that she was writing things that surprised her, things that had a different quality from anything she had written before. Not darker exactly, but more interior, music that seemed to start from a place further inside and travel further out before it resolved. She did not know what to do with this, practically, and so she filed it and continued with the plan. The sale happened on a Tuesday in March. She knew the approximate window. She had been tracking the signals, the specific texture of Declan's evasions and Vivian's silences, and she had arranged to be 3 cities away when it happened, which was not difficult because the tour schedule was real and pre-existing, and she had simply not altered it. She was in Chicago when Nair called her, at 11:40 in the morning, to say that the transaction had been initiated and that the documentation was being preserved in real time. Mara was standing in a hotel room with a view of the lake, and the light on the water was the particular quality of March light over the Great Lakes, which is not warm, but has a clarity that cold air gives to distant surfaces, and she looked at it while Nair spoke and felt nothing she had a name for. Not the satisfaction she had expected, not grief, something that had no obvious architecture. A sensation she associated with the moment in a musical phrase, when the tension has built to the point where resolution is inevitable and the resolution has not yet arrived. "The dealer is documented," Nair said. "Wire transfer initiated this morning. Communications between Voss and the seller. The draft we have from the management platform references the guitar specifically. He used its name. He called it the Wren." "Yes," Mara said. "The proceeds structure is what you anticipated?" "Approximately." "Good." A brief pause. "I'm sorry," Nair said, and her voice had the quality of someone who means it and knows that it is insufficient and says it anyway because leaving it unsaid would also be insufficient. "It's a beautiful instrument." "I know," Mara said. "We'll get it back." "I know that too." The civil suit was filed 11 months later, after the forensic accounting review had been completed. A report that ran to 63 pages and documented, with the particular authority of financial evidence laid out in sequence, the LLC structure, the royalty flows, the gap between the Wren's assessed value and its sale price, the cash payment to Declan that appeared nowhere in the professional relationship's documented record, and the absence of any authorization from Mara for the guitar's sale. Diaghi had added to the complaint a claim for breach of fiduciary duty that rested substantially on the management agreement Declan had signed, the one with the explicit fiduciary clause, and which had been violated by his participation in the guitar sale without Mara's knowledge or consent. The complaint named Declan Voss, Vivian Chen, and Lyra Chen. Mara was in Ajay's conference room when the filing was confirmed. The coffee was the same scorched kind, from the same office machine. Though Ajay set her phone down after the confirmation and said, with the equanimity of someone for whom this was a professional event rather than a personal one, which was precisely what Mara needed from her at this moment. Now we wait for their response. What do you expect? From Voss, denial initially. His attorney will try to argue the management agreement doesn't support the fiduciary claim and that any authorization was implicit. From your stepmother, she'll try to argue the guitar sale was a legitimate asset disposition and that you had some form of standing authorization. The gap between the sale price and assessed value will be the problem they can't resolve. And Lyra? Ajay considered this. She's the peripheral actor. Her exposure is lower. Her attorney, if she retains separate counsel, which I'd advise her to, will likely try to separate her from the other two as quickly as possible. She may be more useful as a witness than as a defendant. Mara thought about her half-sister in the kitchen, the quality of her ease in a house she had always treated as entirely hers. Let her attorneys advise her, she said. I'm not asking for anything specific there. Noted. The discovery process lasted 14 months and had the quality, in Mara's experience of it, of a very long and very precise conversation in which almost nothing was said directly, but everything was communicated through what was produced and withheld and produced late and produced incompletely and produced in formats that required additional processing to render readable. Nair's pre-litigation evidence preservation proved its value during this period. The digital record established before the suit was filed was a foundation that the defense could not disturb. In the end, its existence constrained the degree to which the production process could be shaped. Declan's attorney was a man named Fitch, who had the demeanor of someone who was accustomed to operating in the space between the legal and the merely inappropriate, and who had constructed a defense that rested on several arguments, none of which were strong individually, but which were assembled in the hope that their collective density would obscure the core problem. The core problem, which no amount of procedural complexity could ultimately resolve, was the management agreement. The fiduciary duty clause was explicit. The enumeration of authorized actions did not include asset transactions. The guitar sale was an unauthorized transaction. The cash payment was undisclosed. These were not interpretation problems. They were factual conditions, and factual conditions are, in Ajay's practice, the preferred terrain. Vivian's attorney tried, as Ajay had anticipated, to argue authorization. The documentary record did not support this argument. The specific paperwork that Declan had guided Mara through in the post-accident period, the documents she had signed while medicated and distressed and believing she was authorizing a studio equipment sale, was examined by a document examiner who testified to its scope and to what it did and did not cover. What it did not cover was the guitar. What it did not authorize was any transaction involving the Wren, which was a named, specifically identified item in the insurance documentation and which had been the subject of a standalone valuation. Authorization for its sale would have required a standalone document. No such document existed. Lyra's attorney separated her from the other defendants 4 months into discovery. She was repositioned as a witness. In her deposition, she confirmed the communications between Vivian and Declan that had been preserved in the digital record. She confirmed the sale. She confirmed the proceeds distribution. She answered the questions put to her with the expression of someone who was very aware that the alternative to answering was worse. Mara sat in the deposition room across the table from Lyra and said nothing except what she was asked to confirm, and she kept her face at the precise level of neutrality that she had developed over the preceding 2 years, and that was, she had found, considerably more unsettling to the people across from her than any more visible expression would have been. Lyra did not meet her eyes after the first 20 minutes. The settlement came 16 months after the suit was filed, which was faster than Ajay had expected and which Ajay attributed, in the brief conversation they had after the negotiations concluded, to the fact that the defense's core documents were insurmountable and that continuing to litigate them would require the defendants to spend money they did not have in sufficient supply to outlast a plaintiff whose legal costs were being managed by an attorney who had a financial stake in the outcome. The settlement was confidential in its specific terms. Mara was not going to describe the specific terms. What she would say was that the Wren came home. The private dealer had been located, did so through Nair's investigative work, in possession of a guitar he had been unable to sell at the price he had hoped for, partly because the instrument had not, it developed, come with all of its documentation, and the documentation was what gave it a significant portion of its provenance value, and the documentation had remained with Mara. The dealer, who had, as she had suspected, a quality of ambient guilt about the transaction, was cooperative. The guitar was returned. She was in Ajay's office when it arrived, carried by a courier from the forensic storage facility where it had been held during the evidentiary phase, wrapped in cloth inside a case that was not the original case, but which was adequate. She took it out of the case and held it the way her grandfather had shown her, both hands under the body, and the weight of it was the same, and the finish under her fingers was the same, and the room she was in was an attorney's office in Midtown Manhattan, with the recycled air smell and the scorched coffee, and not the bedroom with the water stain on the ceiling shaped like a crescent, but the guitar was the same guitar. Ajay, who was reviewing a document at her desk, did not look up. "Is it what you expected?" she said. And her voice had the same quality of someone who knows the answer is not simple and is asking because simplicity is not what she is offering. "Yes," Mara said. "Exactly." There were things she had not anticipated. She had not anticipated the quality of silence that followed the settlement. Not the external silence, the absence of litigation, the absence of Declan's presence in her professional life, to the absence of the particular anxiety that comes from knowing something is happening that you cannot stop, but the internal silence. She had lived for 2 years, with the architecture of the plan so present in her mind that it had organized everything else around it, the way a building organizes the space it occupies and the air above it. With the plan completed, the architecture was gone, and the space it had occupied was not empty exactly, it was quiet. She was working out what lived in quiet. The music helped, the new material, the things she had been writing over the 2 years that had surprised her with their quality of being genuinely new. She recorded an album, her 4th, with a producer she had identified during the first Life's long reading period, and whom she had contacted at the right moment in this one. And the album was different from anything she had made before. The reviews, when they came, so used words like internal and stripped, and a kind of exposure that's not vulnerability exactly, but something more considered. She did not entirely disagree. The album did not contain Meridian. It did not reference Meridian or anything like it. There were songs on it that had a different quality of resolution, not the sound of a rival, but something that couldn't be as simply named. The sound of a person standing in a space they have cleared for themselves and assessing what belongs there. Declan, she heard through the industry channels that persist in transmitting information about people, regardless of whether you have any professional interest in receiving it, had taken on several other clients. He was doing adequately. She had no specific knowledge of his financial situation and did not seek any. The settlement terms were what they were. His future was his own concern. But Vivian's house, her father's old house, the one with the fig tree and the kitchen that smelled of preserved lemons, was sold 18 months after the settlement. She heard this through Lyra, who had sent her a brief message that consisted of the news and no further commentary, and she read the message once and set her phone down and thought about her father and the fig tree and the specific quality of afternoon light in that kitchen in summer, and then she thought about something else. She did not respond to the message. A journalist asked her, in an interview timed to the 4th album's release, about her creative process and specifically about the absence of her most commercially known material from both her live sets and her new recording. The journalist was thorough and genuinely interested and had done the research. She mentioned Meridian by name, noted its commercial history, asked whether the decision not to perform it was artistic or personal. that Mara had prepared for this question, though not in the way of preparing a deflection or an evasion. She had simply thought over the preceding months about the honest answer, about what she could say that was true without being more than she intended to share. "I wrote that song in a specific period," she said. "The period is over. The song belongs to it. I don't see the point of performing a document of a period that's finished." "Is it retired permanently?" "Yes." "You don't feel any obligation to audiences who love it?" She considered this. Outside the window of the studio where the interview was being conducted, the city was doing what the city did in late afternoon. The particular quality of light through tall buildings, the way the streets below had a different quality of sound at this hour than at any other. She had played in this city for 10 years. She would continue to play in it. The audiences who loved Meridian would love whatever she gave them next, or they would not, and either outcome was one she could work inside. "I feel a great deal of obligation to audiences," she said. "I play everything I have. I give them everything the music asks of me. But this particular song, no, that one's done." The journalist wrote this down. She was a person who understood. Mara could see that she had received the answer she was going to receive, and that it was the real one. And she moved to the next question. There were 2 more things that happened that year that she had not planned, and that she was not sure, looking back, were entirely separate from the plan in the way she had experienced them at the time. The first was that she went back to the house, her grandfather's house, the one he had lived in until his death, which was not the same as her father's house, and which was a smaller structure in a quieter part of the city, the one Han-Chen had occupied for 50 years, and in which every surface had absorbed the specific smell of spruce and rosin, and the soap he used, and the tea he drank. And she sat in the room he had played in, and played the Wren for the first time since the Rebirth. Not performing, not practicing, simply playing, the way he had taught her before he taught her anything technical. Before he taught her the names of the chords or the mechanics of the right hand, just playing, letting the instrument say whatever the moment contained. She played for 3 hours. She did not play Meridian. She played things that did not have names, music that she had not planned, and that arrived and departed the way music does when you are not trying to make it do anything. At the end of it, the room was very quiet, and the light through the window had moved significantly, and the smell was the same. Spruce and rosin and something underneath. And she sat still for a long time, the way she had sat, 31 years old in a previous life's January, in a room with the water stain on the ceiling. Han-Chen had taught her patience before anything else. He had been right about that, as he had been right about most things. The second thing was that she called Lyra. This surprised her more than anything else that had happened, including the Rebirth, which had at least been a category of event she could locate in the tradition of stories about people who come back with knowledge. Calling Lyra was not in any tradition she had a framework for. It was not part of the plan. It had no strategic utility. It was simply that she had been thinking, in the quiet that followed the plan's completion, about what her father had wanted, not what he had done or failed to do or the things that his death had enabled others to do, but what he had actually wanted. The simple human shape of it, and she thought that what he had wanted was for both his daughters to know each other and to be, if not close, then at least present in each other's lives in some form that wasn't determined by conflict. She did not know if this was possible. She was not sure she wanted it. She was certain she was not the same person who could simply extend the kind of trust that relationship would require. But she called. Lyra answered. The conversation lasted 11 minutes and was, in most of its specifics, unremarkable. They talked about nothing of particular weight, about the city, about a gallery event Lyra had attended, about the album, which Lyra had listened to. At the end, Lyra said without preamble, sorry about the guitar, and her voice had the quality of someone saying a thing they have needed to say for some time, and that is not, despite the time elapsed, any easier for the delay. Mara did not say what she might have said in the first life before she understood that forgiveness is not an emotion she could have performed, and that its absence is not the same as the presence of its opposite. She said, "It's back now," which was true and was the most accurate thing she could offer. And Lyra said, "I know," and then they ended the call. She did not know what would come of it. She knew what she was going to do next. The fifth album was already taking shape. She could hear it in the pieces she had been writing, a different architecture again. Something that built differently from the fourth, that used more space, that asked the listener to sit inside the pauses in a way she hadn't asked before. She had a title, not final, but a direction. Something about what you build after you've cleared the ground. She would not use those words. She would find the musical equivalent of them and let the words remain hers. She was going to play every city she had played in the first life, and some she hadn't. She was going to play with the musicians she had been finding over the preceding 2 years, people who played with the quality of listening that she had always looked for and seldom found, and who could hold the space she was building with the necessary combination of restraint and generosity. She had dates, she had venues, she had the legal architecture of Wren Sound Holdings, LLC, intact and clean and entirely hers, and the catalog inside it registered and protected and generating the revenue that registered and protected catalogs generate. She had the Wren sitting on its stand in the corner of her room, the water stain on the ceiling shaped like a crescent. The light through the curtains, the specific January quality of her 31st year. The show in New York was the last night of the tour, and the venue was one she had played before, in the first life, and in this one, a hall with good acoustics and a balcony that filled from the back forward when the show was strong. She walked on stage to the particular quality of crowd warmth and anticipation that is the same in every venue and every city, and that she had spent her adult life walking into. And she stood at the microphone with the Wren, and the room became quiet in the way rooms become quiet when the thing they are waiting for has arrived. She played for 2 hours and 20 minutes. She played the new material and the old material. She played 3 songs from the fourth album that she had not performed live before, and that the audience received with the particular quality of attention that means people are listening, actually listening. Not performing their enthusiasm, but tracking what is happening. She played 2 songs from the first album that she rarely performed anymore, and that surprised the crowd with their presence. She played 1 long improvisation late in the set that started as something she had planned and became something she had not, the way the best playing does. She did not play Meridian. There was a moment late in the set when she heard it, not from the crowd, not a shout or a request, just a quality in the room's anticipation, a shape it was making as she moved through the final stretch of the set. That was the shape of waiting for a particular thing. She felt it and recognized it and did not acknowledge it, and she played instead the last new song, the one that ended on an open chord she had written specifically to hang in the air without resolving cleanly, and the room held the sound until it faded. Then, she set the Wren carefully on its stand, upright. The way her grandfather had shown her, because you treat it like a living thing you're responsible for, and she looked at the audience and said nothing. She walked off the stage. Behind her, the open chord was still fading.